The airport lounge was bustling with activity, as it always was during rush hour. Passengers from all walks of life, from business moguls to families on vacation, milled about, clutching their boarding passes, eyeing the food court, and checking the departure screens. At gate 32, a man sat alone, his unkempt hair slightly disheveled, and his faded jacket ill-fitting for the normally pristine environment of the business-class lounge. He didn't look like someone you'd expect to see in such a place. The staff, however, didn't give him a second glance. There was no way they could have known the truth. "Excuse me, sir," a voice rang out. A young woman from the customer service desk approached with an air of authority. "This lounge is reserved for business-class passengers. You'll have to leave." The man looked up, his expression calm, though his eyes were hidden behind a pair of dark sunglasses. "I've paid for this seat," he muttered, trying to keep his voice steady, but the irritation was starting to show. The young woman, not one to let things slide, took a closer look at him. "I'm sorry, sir, but we can't make exceptions. I'll have to ask you to vacate." He sighed, wondering how this had turned into such a scene. His voice, barely above a whisper, carried a weight of frustration. "I understand," he said. "I'll go." But just as he stood, a group of other staff members arrived, blocking his path. Their demeanor was cold, unyielding, and the man felt the familiar sting of injustice settle in. It wasn't the first time his identity had been questioned, but it was the first time it felt so personal. The airport lounge was a typical scene of rush-hour chaos. Passengers hurrying to their gates, kids running in circles, the hum of coffee machines, and the low murmur of conversations in multiple languages. A few businessmen clicked away on laptops, while families tried to juggle bags, snacks, and travel documents. It was a microcosm of the world at large, each person in their own bubble, eager to get to their destination. At gate 32, however, one man sat apart from the crowd. He was slightly slumped in his seat, his attire inconspicuous but out of place for the luxury lounge. An old, unbuttoned jacket, worn-out sneakers, and a pair of sunglasses that hid most of his face. His demeanor suggested he didn't want attention, yet somehow, he seemed to draw it. No one suspected who he was. "Excuse me, sir," a voice cut through the noise of the lounge. A young woman in a sharp blue uniform stood before him, her arms crossed, her face set in a neutral expression. She was well-trained, her tone polite yet firm. "This lounge is for business-class passengers only. You'll have to leave." The man looked up slowly, pushing his sunglasses up to reveal a tired set of eyes. His jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "I've paid for this seat," he replied, though there was an edge to his words that betrayed his frustration. The woman didn't flinch. She glanced down at her tablet, then back at him. "I'm sorry, sir, but this area is exclusive for business class only. I'll have to ask you to vacate." He sighed, pushing himself out of the chair with a small grunt, but the action felt heavier than it should have. His patience was wearing thin, and the thought of another confrontation weighed on him. But he knew how this would play out. He'd either be kicked out quietly, or he'd have to escalate things. He preferred not to make a scene. As he began to gather his belongings, the young woman, still standing in front of him, didn't seem to recognize how awkward the situation had become. She was doing her job, but there was a certain coldness to her tone, as if his presence was more of an inconvenience than anything else. "Is there a problem, Sarah?" Another staff member, a man in his 30s, approached from behind the desk, his voice carrying the air of authority that came with a managerial position. The young woman, Sarah, didn't even glance at him before responding. "This man is not a business-class passenger. I've asked him to leave." "Noted." The manager turned to the man sitting at the chair, scanning him briefly before addressing him with a polite but firm tone. "Sir, we need to vacate this area for more important guests. I'm afraid we'll have to ask you to move to the general seating area." The man, growing tired of the way he was being treated, took a deep breath. He had been through countless meetings and boardrooms, had held press conferences, and had his face plastered on every major media outlet around the world. But here, in this sterile lounge, in the middle of a busy airport, he was just another traveler. Another person to be dismissed, another person to be disregarded. "Fine," he said, barely able to conceal the bitterness in his voice. "I'll go." He grabbed his bag, slipping on his sunglasses again, his jaw tightening as he rose to leave. But before he could make it to the door, a third staff member appeared, a larger man who seemed to be in charge of maintaining order within the lounge. He took one look at the man and then at Sarah and the manager. "You're kicking him out?" the new arrival asked, his voice filled with surprise. "Why?" The manager, clearly a little defensive, cleared his throat. "He's not a business class passenger. It's policy. He'll need to move to the regular seating area." The man standing before them, still not revealing his true identity, paused. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the lounge beginning to drift in his direction. Whispers started to rise, and he could hear people muttering, wondering why the staff was causing such a fuss. "Listen," he said quietly, his voice now calm but dripping with a touch of authority. "I've paid for this seat. I'm not looking for trouble, but I'd like to stay." The new staff member, clearly annoyed, stood even taller, crossing his arms. "It's not up for debate. You need to leave now." The situation was escalating. The man's patience was running thin, but instead of backing down, he stood his ground. He glanced around at the other passengers, who were now looking more intently at him. Some were whispering to each other, clearly noticing the tension, but no one stepped in. And in that moment, something seemed to click for him. It wasn't about the lounge. It wasn't about the policy. It wasn't even about the staff. It was about how, despite everything he had accomplished, despite the people who looked up to him, he was still just another person at the mercy of bureaucracy. And it stung. "Is there a problem here?" A voice broke through the mounting tension. Sarah and the manager turned toward the sound, both of them looking surprised to see a man in a sharp suit striding toward them. He had the air of someone important, someone who was used to getting things done. As he reached the group, his eyes flicked to the man still standing by the lounge door. A moment of recognition passed between them. The man in the suit's eyes widened ever so slightly. "Well, this is a bit of a mix-up," the man said smoothly, turning to the staff. "I think we've handled this poorly, don't you think?" It was then that the truth slowly started to settle in, and a moment of realization swept across the room. One that would change everything. As the realization set in, the sharp-suited man gave a subtle, but knowing look toward the person still standing in front of him, Elon Musk. His gaze lingered, shifting between the staff and the somewhat disheveled man who'd been kicked out of the lounge. Elon, now standing with his head slightly bowed and his hands tucked in the pockets of his jacket, felt a strange blend of frustration and resignation. His eyes, usually full of intensity and focus, seemed to lose some of that power as they narrowed in on the ground. He had long come to terms with his public persona, the media whirlwind that followed him wherever he went. But in this moment, he was nothing more than a regular traveler trying to relax, attempting to escape the constant barrage of expectations. Do you mind if we have a word?" the man in the sharp suit asked, his voice smooth but tinged with a faint sense of discomfort. He addressed the airport staff but gestured toward Elon, signaling for him to follow. The staff, momentarily flustered, stepped aside. The manager cleared his throat. "Of course, sir. We just thought." "No," the man in the suit cut him off, his expression now more serious. "You thought wrong. I'm afraid you've just made a big mistake." Elon, who had been silent up to that point, finally raised his head to meet the man's gaze. His face was expressionless, but there was a hint of something in his eyes, a mixture of surprise, indignation, and something else, something harder to pinpoint. "Thanks," Elon said, his voice low but controlled. "But this is exactly the kind of thing I've been trying to avoid." He motioned around the terminal, the noise and chaos continuing as if nothing had happened. "I'm not looking for trouble, and I don't want special treatment. But when people treat you like a nobody, it's a wake-up call." The man in the suit nodded, clearly understanding what Elon meant, even if the staff didn't. He adjusted his tie slightly, a nervous habit, before turning back to the airport staff. "You have no idea who you've been speaking to, do you?" The staff looked at him in confusion, unsure if the statement was some sort of reprimand or just a passing comment. The sharp-suited man smiled slightly, almost incredulously, before he turned toward Elon his face shifting from confusion to realization. "Wait, are you?" Elon didn't answer immediately. Instead, he simply adjusted his sunglasses and took a slow, deliberate breath. Then, in a voice that carried a certain calm authority, he replied, "I am Elon Musk." The silence that followed was palpable. The airport staff stood frozen, their faces blanching as they finally processed the magnitude of the situation. One of the staff members, the younger woman who had first confronted him, looked as though she might faint. Her lips parted, but no words came out. The man in the sharp suit stepped forward, as if realizing the full extent of the blunder that had just occurred. "Mr. Musk, I apologize for the misunderstanding. You shouldn't have been treated that way." Elon simply nodded, his expression still unreadable. It was clear he wasn't angry, at least, not outwardly. Instead, there was something much deeper behind his eyes. Something that spoke of years of dealing with the constant pressure of his fame, the expectations that never stopped, and the human side of himself that sometimes got lost in the whirlwind. "I didn't want special treatment," Elon continued, his tone calm, almost resigned. "I just wanted to sit in the lounge like any other person. The whole reason I travel like this, under the radar, is because I don't want to be treated differently. But I guess it's not that easy." The staff now stood in awkward silence, unsure of how to proceed. They had all made a huge mistake, and the weight of it hung in the air like a cloud. The man in the suit, now realizing that an apology wasn't enough, offered a simple solution. "I'll get you moved to another lounge. I'll personally make sure everything is handled. It's the least we can do." Elon gave a small shrug, his gaze drifting back toward the busy terminal. "No need," he said softly. "I'm not here for perks. I'm here to think, to rest. I just needed some space, but I guess this was a reminder I can't escape who I am." His words hit a little too hard, and the weight of the situation settled in. The staff members were still trying to process everything, unsure of what to do next. They had been so quick to judge him, to dismiss him, and now the reality of who they had been dealing with hit them like a freight train. The man in the suit gave a brief nod, then turned to the staff, his voice stern. "I suggest you take this as a learning opportunity. Not every person who walks through here is just another traveler, and you should never judge someone based on their appearance." One of the staff members, still red-faced, opened his mouth to apologize but was cut off by the sharp-suited man. "Enough. Mr. Musk deserves better than this. We'll take care of the rest." Elon, who had remained calm throughout the ordeal, seemed to deflate slightly. He exhaled deeply, the tension in his body finally easing, but his mind was still on what had just transpired. He couldn't help but wonder how many others had been treated this way. How many times had someone walked into a situation only to be ignored or belittled because they didn't fit a certain mold? The truth was, Elon had become so accustomed to the spotlight that he had started to crave normalcy. The chance to just be a regular person, to blend in, to not have people constantly looking over his shoulder or making assumptions about him based on the company he built or the technology he created. And yet, here he was, once again, finding himself at the center of a storm he didn't want. A storm that had been sparked by nothing more than a simple misunderstanding. A misunderstanding that, as it turned out, had shaken both him and the people involved to their core. As he made his way toward the new lounge that the staff hastily arranged, he couldn't help but think, this wasn't just a fluke. This was a sign. Maybe it was time to go back to basics, to remember why he started all this in the first place, to make a difference, not just in the world, but in the way people treated each other. As Elon made his way to the new lounge, the weight of the situation didn't fully hit him until he found a quiet corner, far from the bustle of the terminal. The lounge was more peaceful, so much more relaxed than the first one, where the hustle of people and the thrum of conversations had felt suffocating. This one had soft chairs, calming lighting, and the distant clink of cups being set on tables. He settled into an armchair, sighing as he ran a hand through his hair. For the first time in a while, he felt like he could breathe, but his mind kept returning to what had just happened, the way he had been treated, the assumption that he was just another ordinary man, one who didn't belong in a space that was supposed to be exclusive. How quickly people jumped to conclusions about him. Elon closed his eyes for a moment, trying to calm himself, but the thought gnawed at him. He had spent years building a company that changed the way the world thought about electric cars, space travel, and renewable energy. He had revolutionized industries, taken enormous risks, and yet, this simple, dehumanizing moment made him question something he hadn't for a long time: the way society viewed success, wealth, and the people who achieved it. In an instant, he had gone from one of the most influential men in the world to a faceless traveler who was tossed aside like any other unimportant person. It wasn't the first time it had happened, of course. Elon was no stranger to the public's tendency to overlook the person beneath the persona, but it still hurt, perhaps more than he'd expected. The minutes ticked by as he sat in silence, the buzz of the airport outside just a faint murmur. His phone buzzed on the table in front of him, and he glanced down to see a notification from one of his assistants. A meeting reminder, a text message about a new product launch, several others about upcoming projects. But none of it felt as important as the thought that had taken root in his mind. The airport incident was being talked about now. He could feel it. He could almost sense the gossip spreading through the staff, the passengers, the public, especially with how easily it had escalated. In today's social media age, something as small as an interaction in a busy airport could become a viral sensation in the blink of an eye. And sure enough, within an hour, the first tweets, Facebook posts, and Instagram stories began to emerge. Just saw Elon Musk kicked out of the business class lounge at the airport. What the hell? What's with the rude staff? I'd be pissed too if I were Elon Musk. Elon's probably used to this kind of stuff. Hashtag moneydoesn't fixaverrying. As more posts came in, the story began to pick up speed. People were shocked. People were outraged. Some felt sorry for him. Others thought it was a small price to pay for the privileges that came with being a billionaire. But everyone had an opinion. Everyone had something to say about it. The ripple effect had started, and there was no stopping it. Meanwhile, back at the lounge, the staff members who had been involved in the incident couldn't shake the discomfort they felt. Sarah, the young woman who had initially confronted Elon, paced nervously by the desk. Her supervisor, the manager, sat with his head in his hands, clearly frustrated with how everything had turned out. I don't get it," Sarah muttered, her eyes flicking to the other staff around her. "How did we not know? How did I not recognize him?" The manager, still in disbelief, leaned back in his chair and exhaled heavily. "You weren't the only one who didn't recognize him. None of us did. But still, it's a colossal mistake. A mistake we'll have to own. Do you realize how badly this is going to hurt our reputation?" Another staff member spoke up, their voice trembling slightly. "It's already online. People are talking about it. There's no way we can take that back now." The tension in the room was thick. Everyone could feel the consequences of the moment, the mistake that would echo far beyond the walls of the airport lounge. Back in the lounge where Elon sat, his phone continued to buzz with incoming messages and notifications. He picked it up, his thumb hovering over the screen. A text from his PR team popped up, followed by one from his sister, and then a few messages from people within his company. PR team, Elon, we need to address the situation. It's already getting attention online. Are you okay? Do you want us to handle the narrative? He paused before typing back, his mind racing with the options before him. There was the usual route, issue an apology, or at least express his frustration with the incident. That would calm the public, quell the outrage, and show his followers that he didn't mind being human in a world obsessed with the myth of perfection. Or he could ignore it, let it simmer, and watch how it played out. He quickly dismissed the second option. After a moment's thought, Elon typed out a short, clear message. Elon Musk, it's a reminder that we're all just people. No one is above being treated like anyone else. I didn't want to make a big deal of it. But if this is what it takes to remind people to be kind, then so be it. He pressed send. Elon leaned back in his chair, waiting for the world's reaction to his simple statement. Part of him wondered if his words would make a difference, or if it would just fuel the fire. He was about to find out. The next morning, the world had already shifted. The news outlets had picked up the story, and the tweets had gone viral. Elon Musk kicked out of airport lounge. How a mistake sparked a global conversation about class and humanity. Social media erupted. Some praised Elon for his calm response, saying it was proof of his humility. Others criticized the airport staff, calling for accountability and better training for how to handle high-profile individuals. But there was one thing everyone agreed on. Elon's message about kindness and humanity had struck a chord. In an age of constant judgment and superficial interactions, his words had brought a brief moment of reflection to a world obsessed with status. But the question lingered. What would happen next? Would Elon Musk, the billionaire tech mogul, be remembered for his innovations and accomplishments? Or would this incident forever be attached to his legacy? As the conversation continued to unfold across the globe, Elon realized that sometimes the smallest moments in life could lead to the most profound changes. The news cycle had a funny way of moving quickly. What started as a small incident in a quiet airport lounge had spiraled into a global discussion. By the time Elon woke up the next morning, his phone was flooded with notifications. His email inbox, his social media accounts, and his PR team's text chain were all buzzing nonstop. He groaned, sitting up in bed, rubbing his eyes. His mind had barely processed what had happened the day before, and now, it seemed like the entire world was focused on a single moment. As he scrolled through his phone, the messages came in waves. Elon Musk just showed us the importance of humility. Not many people would take that kind of treatment without losing their cool. Airline staff embarrassed themselves by kicking Elon Musk out. Someone should have recognized him. He's changed the world. Didn't realize how hard it must be for someone like Elon to just travel like a normal person. His message is bigger than just the airport. Elon tapped his phone screen, scanning more articles and comments. There were those who empathized with him, who saw the moment as a necessary lesson in humanity and humility. There were others who seemed to think he was playing the victim card, but most of the conversation was leaning toward praise. For his calm, for his approach to the mistake. Yet, for Elon, this wasn't about recognition. It never had been. His thoughts drifted back to the deeper implications of what had happened, what had been said. It wasn't about the media frenzy or the viral tweets. It was about the bigger conversation he wanted to spark. The truth was, he had never wanted to be seen as a godlike figure. Yes, he was in the public eye, but the constant media attention, the expectations, those had become more of a burden than a privilege. The incident at the airport had reminded him of something he had long buried beneath his work and ambition. It was a reminder of his own need for human connection, for normalcy, for a world where kindness didn't depend on who you were or what you had. He had spent so much time in the spotlight, constantly shifting between the world of innovation and the public's need to elevate him to some unreachable standard. But that brief moment at the airport, a moment of being treated as just another person, had changed something inside him. As the day wore on, Elon's PR team requested a meeting. They needed to discuss the next steps, the public's reaction, and how to frame the narrative moving forward. When Elon finally joined the video call, his PR team was already well prepared, presenting him with a variety of strategies. Some wanted to keep the momentum going, using the viral moment to shift the conversation into a larger initiative about class and empathy. Others suggested he let it die down and continue focusing on his work. But Elon was already thinking beyond the typical PR response. "I don't want to make this about me," he said firmly, leaning back in his chair, his gaze focused but calm. "This isn't about me being treated poorly. This is about how society is so quick to judge people based on their status and how quickly we forget that we're all human." His PR manager nodded, carefully considering his words. "So, you want to shift the conversation to something bigger, then? Maybe a campaign about how to treat others with respect, regardless of their position in life." "Exactly," Elon said. "Not just some feel-good PR stunt, but a real conversation, a shift in mindset." The team agreed. They would support him, but they knew that Elon's words needed to come from a place of authenticity. The public was already watching, and this moment, no matter how small it seemed, was an opportunity for something much larger. Meanwhile, the airport staff had become a part of the larger conversation as well. The social media backlash hadn't spared them. Sarah, the young woman who had confronted Elon, had become the face of the misunderstanding. News outlets ran headlines like, "Airport staff kicks out Elon Musk, a lesson in humility and misjudgment." She found herself at the center of a media storm that she never anticipated. The messages on her social media were a mix of support and condemnation, some even offering their own advice on how she should have handled the situation differently. She had never imagined that a simple mistake could lead to something so far-reaching. One evening, as she sat in her apartment scrolling through her phone, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the incident. There were moments when she wanted to throw in the towel and disappear from the spotlight, but other times, she recognized the opportunity to reflect on how she had acted and what it had taught her. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a direct message from her manager. "Sarah, they're offering you an interview on one of the morning news programs. They want to hear your side of the story. They want to know how you're handling everything." She stared at the message for a long moment. She didn't know if she was ready for a public conversation about what had happened. How could she explain herself? How could she make people understand that she didn't know who Elon Musk was in that moment? How could she convey that it was just a simple mistake, something she regretted deeply? But then another thought crossed her mind. Maybe this was a chance for her to own up to the mistake, to show the world that she had learned from it, that she too was human. She knew she would have to answer difficult questions. She would have to address the fact that she had treated him like just another passenger. And she would need to explain how the entire situation had impacted her perspective on the way people interact with others. She had judged him because he didn't look like someone special. It was an assumption she wished she could take back. After a deep breath, Sarah texted her manager back, "I'll do it. But let's make sure the conversation is about more than just the incident. I want to talk about what we all can learn from this." Back at Tesla headquarters, Elon spent the next few days reflecting. His phone had barely stopped buzzing. News outlets were contacting his team for follow-up statements. But more importantly, people were reaching out to him privately, offering their own perspectives on what the situation had taught them. It was more than just a viral moment. It had sparked something larger than him, something real. People were talking about empathy, about understanding each other. And Elon realized something. Maybe, just maybe, this was the kind of conversation the world needed. The incident wasn't just an embarrassing moment. It had opened doors to a larger discussion about society's obsession with labels, status, and superficial judgments. Elon knew that he couldn't solve all the world's problems with a tweet, but this moment was his opportunity to challenge the way people viewed success and status. To remind them that, no matter how high you climb, you're still just a person, just like everyone else. And with that, Elon felt a shift within himself. Maybe, for the first time in a long time, he could focus on something beyond building the next big thing. Maybe the real mission was teaching people to value each other, not based on their wealth, but on their humanity. The conversation was just beginning, and Elon was ready to take the lead. The morning news interview with Sarah was scheduled for the following day, and she felt a knot in her stomach the entire night before. She had replayed the events of the airport over and over in her head, wondering how the conversation might unfold, and if she'd be able to express herself in a way that would make people understand her perspective. The studio was bustling when Sarah arrived. Bright lights, cameramen adjusting equipment, and producers shouting instructions filled the room. It felt like the spotlight had already been turned on her before the cameras even started rolling. It was all too surreal for her, the quiet airport lounge worker now in the center of this media whirlwind. As Sarah sat in front of the interviewer, the questions came fast and hard. The interviewer, a well-known host with a friendly demeanor, started by addressing the controversy directly. "So, Sarah," the host began, "you were the one who asked Elon Musk to leave the business class lounge at the airport. What exactly went through your mind when you approached him?" Sarah shifted in her seat, taking a deep breath. "Honestly, I didn't know who he was," she replied. "He didn't look like someone who should be in the lounge. He wasn't dressed in any way that stood out. And like I said in the moment, I was just following procedure. But once I found out who he was, once I realized my mistake, I felt embarrassed, deeply embarrassed." The host nodded sympathetically. "It's understandable, Sarah. But the question is, why do you think something like this could happen? How did no one recognize him?" Sarah hesitated for a moment before answering. "It wasn't about not recognizing him. I think it's more about how easy it is to forget that someone's worth isn't defined by how they look or how much money they have. I judged him because of his appearance. I assumed he didn't belong. That was my mistake, and I regret it deeply." The camera zoomed in slightly as Sarah continued, her voice gaining more strength as she spoke. The truth is, I've been thinking about that moment nonstop. It wasn't about the lounge or the protocol. It was about how we treat people. We all carry assumptions about others, and I think that's a huge part of the problem. We forget that everyone is human, regardless of their social status. The host was quiet for a moment, clearly processing her words. That's a powerful message, Sarah, and it's a sentiment that many of us don't often stop to reflect on. As the interview went on, Sarah's vulnerability and sincerity started to resonate with viewers. There was something raw about her admission that she had made a mistake, but also that she had learned from it. It wasn't about shame or guilt. It was about growth. It was about acknowledging the humanity in others, no matter who they were. Meanwhile, Elon watched the interview from his office, his attention focused on the screen. He had been keeping up with the media's take on the situation, but he hadn't anticipated how Sarah would handle the fallout. As he listened to her words, something inside him shifted. Elon had expected the usual round of apologies or corporate speak, but Sarah wasn't trying to play the victim. She wasn't hiding behind an excuse or a simple sorry. She was owning the mistake, but more importantly, she was pointing out a bigger truth, a truth that matched his own thoughts about empathy, judgment, and human connection. He was impressed, but there was something else in her words that resonated with him, something he hadn't expected. Sarah had found a way to turn a small, embarrassing moment into a chance for personal growth and societal reflection. It reminded him of the very message he had been trying to communicate through his own tweet about kindness, humility, and seeing people for who they truly were. As soon as the interview ended, Elon sat down and drafted a message. He knew what he had to do next. Elon Musk, at Sarah, your words about empathy and growth really hit home. We all make mistakes. What matters is how we learn from them. I'm proud of how you handled the situation and the bigger conversation you've started. Let's keep this going. He sent it off. The response to Sarah's interview was immediate. People on social media and in the media outlets quickly began praising her for her honest reflection and her ability to turn a mistake into a learning opportunity. But Elon's tweet added an unexpected layer of complexity to the situation. It wasn't just the billionaire tech mogul giving her a nod of approval. It was a call to action. It was a statement that signified the start of a broader conversation about kindness and empathy. People began to talk, not just about the incident itself, but about how often judgment was passed on others based on preconceived notions. The conversation shifted. No longer was it simply about the mistake that was made at the airport. It became about the culture of judgment and how easily people, regardless of their status, could be overlooked or misjudged. The comments about wealth and status shifted into discussions about what it meant to be seen, not for what you had, but for who you were. Elon and Sarah's messages were a catalyst. The idea that empathy could be learned, shared, and acted upon became a viral movement. In a world that constantly seemed to prioritize success and recognition over humanity, this moment felt like a turning point. The focus was no longer on the rich and powerful. It was on how we treated the people around us. In the days following the interview, Sarah received an overwhelming amount of messages, many from people who shared their own experiences of feeling judged or overlooked. It wasn't just about Elon Musk anymore. It was about how society often valued people based on appearances and superficial metrics. Sarah realized that her own life had been shaped by these same biases, but now she saw the world differently. She began responding to some of the messages, sharing her thoughts on the matter. It's a reminder, she said in one reply, that we all need to be more careful with how we treat others. No one should be judged by how they look or what they have. It's about the person inside. But for every supportive message, there were still a few critical ones. People who dismissed her admission or tried to downplay the significance of the situation. There were still plenty of voices who wanted to focus on the drama, on the mistake, and not on the lesson to be learned. But Sarah, in a way, had already moved beyond that. She had come to understand that the message was bigger than her, bigger than Elon. It was about all of us, about society as a whole. Elon's PR team continued to ride the wave of attention, but their focus had shifted as well. They weren't concerned with cleaning up a PR mess anymore. They were leading the charge on a new initiative, one that was less about promoting a product and more about promoting the idea of seeing the humanity in others. They worked with Sarah to set up a public forum, a panel discussion where she, Elon, and several others could talk about the themes of empathy, societal assumptions, and personal growth. The world had already caught on to the idea that these two figures, one a world-renowned billionaire, the other a regular airport worker, were now united in this shared mission. And they weren't alone in this cause. More and more people were talking about what it meant to challenge preconceived notions and to treat everyone with dignity. As Elon looked out his office window, watching the city unfold beneath him, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. Not just for himself, but for the world. It was a small start, a viral moment. But if it could change just one person's perspective, or start a ripple of kindness and empathy in a world that often seemed so focused on division, maybe that was enough. Maybe that was where true change began. The world had taken notice. What had started as a viral airport moment, a simple misunderstanding, had evolved into a conversation that seemed to transcend borders, ideologies, and industries. The idea that empathy and kindness could be as influential as wealth or success had captured the public's imagination in a way no one expected. The forum Elon and Sarah had planned was fast approaching. It was set to be a televised panel, where they would speak about the lessons they had learned from the airport incident, as well as dive into deeper discussions on how society views success and the judgments that often come with it. The media buzzed in anticipation, and it felt as though this moment had evolved into something far greater than anyone could have anticipated. For Sarah, the build-up to the panel felt overwhelming. The days leading up to the event were filled with rehearsals, preparations, and endless media requests. She was no longer just the young woman who had made a mistake in an airport lounge. She was now someone whose voice could carry weight, whose story had the potential to change the way people thought about how they treated others. But with that newfound platform came a heavy responsibility. She had to be careful not to let the message get lost in the noise. She didn't want the story to become about her mistakes. She wanted it to be about the opportunity to grow, to learn, and to challenge the assumptions we make about one another. Elon, for his part, was equally reflective. He had already spent years at the forefront of technology and innovation, but this was something different. He had never imagined that one small moment could stir such a broad conversation about empathy, human connection, and humility. The world had already begun to pay attention, but the true test was whether they could sustain the conversation. Could this momentum continue to grow? As the day of the panel approached, the tension in the air was palpable. The venue was packed. Media from all over the world had flown in to cover the event. There was a palpable sense that this wasn't just a one-time thing. It was the beginning of something bigger. The panel began, and the audience listened intently as Elon and Sarah took their seats. The moderator, a well-respected journalist, opened with a question that had been on everyone's mind. Elon, Sarah, she began. You've both become symbols of something much bigger than yourselves. What do you think is the most important takeaway from the airport incident? And why do you think it resonated with so many people? Elon took the first turn, speaking with his usual calm but focused demeanor. For me, it was a reminder that no matter how successful or famous you become, it's important to stay grounded. We live in a world where people are often judged by what they have or what they do. But at the end of the day, we are all human beings. It's that humanity that should matter most. Sarah nodded in agreement, her eyes focused on the crowd as she spoke. I think the incident opened a lot of eyes, including my own. I made a judgment based on appearances, and I learned how easy it is to do that without realizing it. It's not about where someone is in life, but who they are. And for me, that's where the conversation should start. Recognizing the person in front of you, not the title or the job or the wealth. The audience was silent, absorbed in their words. The moderator then turned to the next question. But, Sarah, you've received a lot of criticism since the incident. Some say you were too quick to judge, that you shouldn't have acted the way you did, regardless of who he was. How do you respond to that? Sarah exhaled deeply before replying. I don't think I could have handled it differently in the moment. I wasn't trying to judge him based on anything other than the situation. But I think that's the point. I made a mistake, yes, but I also recognized it. It wasn't about a celebrity or a public figure being treated unfairly. It was about treating everyone with respect. It doesn't matter who they are or what they do. Kindness and respect should be the baseline. Elon added, "We all make mistakes. We all slip up. What matters is how we learn from those mistakes and how we use those moments to become better people." Sarah showed tremendous growth. We both did. The conversation shifted seamlessly into discussions about the wider implications of judgments based on wealth, status, and appearance. Elon spoke about his own experiences being judged as a billionaire and how, even as someone who had revolutionized multiple industries, he still faced preconceived notions about his worth. "I've had people judge me for my success, for my fortune," Elon said, "but the truth is, I never wanted to be seen as an icon or a tech mogul. I wanted to be seen for my ideas, my efforts, and my passion. But that's not always the way people perceive you. We all carry assumptions, and I've been a part of that system too." Sarah nodded. "And for me, it was eye-opening to realize how much of that judgment comes from a lack of understanding. It's so easy to assume things about people based on how they appear, but when we take the time to understand who they are, we might see things differently." The dialogue continued, weaving in personal anecdotes and societal critiques. The audience, initially unsure of what to expect from a discussion like this, was fully engaged, taking in every word as if they had been waiting for this conversation their whole lives. It was a rare moment in a world that often focused on division. Here, in this space, empathy and understanding were the driving forces. After the panel ended, there was a buzz of excitement in the air. The discussion had touched on something deeper, something universal. It wasn't about the mistake that had sparked it all, but about the opportunity it had presented to start a global conversation about kindness, understanding, and the value of every individual. In the following weeks, the conversation would continue to evolve. Social media campaigns would be launched in response to the panel. People from all walks of life would start to share their own stories of judgment, empathy, and human connection. The hashtag #SeeTheHuman would trend worldwide, with people from different backgrounds discussing how they'd been misjudged or how they had misjudged others. As Elon walked off the stage after the panel, he caught Sarah's eye. They exchanged a knowing look. What had started as a small mistake, something that could have been easily swept under the rug, had grown into something much larger than they had ever imagined. It was more than just a viral moment. It was a movement, one that challenged the way we see each other, one that reminded us all that no matter who we are all, first and foremost, human. And as Elon left the venue that day, he couldn't help but feel that this conversation, this ripple they had created together, had only just begun. As the weeks passed, something remarkable began to happen. The panel discussion that Elon and Sarah had led wasn't just a fleeting moment. It had sparked a movement, one that reached far beyond the confines of social media. The message of empathy, kindness, and truly seeing the person in front of you began to resonate deeply with people from all walks of life. It was no longer just about a billionaire and an airport lounge worker. It was about every person who had ever felt judged, misunderstood, or overlooked. It was about everyone who had ever made a snap judgment about someone else. The hashtag #SeeTheHuman became a rallying cry. It spread across social platforms like wildfire, used in personal stories, articles, videos, and even school projects. Thousands of people began sharing their experiences, stories of the times they'd been unfairly judged, or the times they realized they judged others based on shallow perceptions. People shared how they had learned to open their hearts, to stop seeing the surface, and to truly see each other. Schools began implementing programs that encouraged students to look beyond appearances and embrace the differences in one another. Nonprofits dedicated to fighting prejudice and bias found new platforms to spread their message. Businesses started to take notice, integrating empathy into their corporate culture. From tech companies to local coffee shops, it was clear that the ripple effect had reached every corner of society. But it wasn't just the public that had been impacted. In the tech world, Elon's own companies began incorporating a stronger focus on empathy and understanding. Tesla, SpaceX, and Neuralink all started organizing internal workshops where employees were taught to address their biases and were encouraged to view colleagues and customers as people first, not as roles or job titles. Elon knew that change within the tech industry was more than just about creating groundbreaking products. It was about how people interacted with one another, how they viewed success, and how they defined their worth. He knew that fostering an environment of understanding and empathy would have a lasting impact, not just on the companies he led, but on the world. Sarah, on the other hand, had quickly become a public advocate for social change. She had received countless offers to speak at conferences, partner with organizations, and become an ambassador for causes that aligned with the message of kindness and human connection. But despite the recognition, she remained grounded. She had never set out to become a public figure. Her only goal had been to learn from her own mistake and ensure that people, no matter who they were treated with respect. The offers that came her way were tempting, but she took her time to weigh each opportunity carefully. She didn't want to jump into something simply because of the attention. Sarah wanted to make sure that whatever cause she supported would genuinely contribute to the change she had started. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings, Sarah sat at home with a cup of tea, scrolling through social media. She came across a post that struck her deeply, an image of a woman with her child at an airport, smiling at the camera, with the caption, "Thanks to #SeeTheHuman, I was reminded that my story matters. That my son's story matters. No one should be judged by how they look, but by who they are." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. It wasn't just that this woman had been inspired by the message. It was the fact that the conversation had expanded. The woman had understood what Sarah had come to realize. The impact of a single moment, a single choice, could change the way we see the world. It wasn't about one person's mistake. It was about breaking free from the cycle of judgment that had plagued society for so long. Across the globe, the message of #SeeTheHuman was beginning to make waves even in the political sphere. Politicians from both sides of the aisle began acknowledging the importance of empathy in public policy and social reform. They called for more inclusive legislation that would ensure equal treatment for all people, regardless of their appearance or background. The movement wasn't about political affiliation. It was about how we can all take responsibility for fostering a more compassionate society. One evening, Elon received a call from an old friend, a senator in Washington, D.C., who had been following the movement with keen interest. "Elon, we've been talking here about the impact that #SeeTheHuman is having. It's not just making a difference in how people view each other. It's reshaping policy. We need to push this even further. What do you think about coming to D.C. to speak on the importance of empathy in shaping future legislation? It could make a real difference." Elon paused for a moment, thinking, "I think it's important that we take this conversation to places where people don't often talk about the heart of things. If we can get more people to understand that empathy and human connection are essential to solving the big issues, then maybe we can start seeing real progress." The senator agreed. "I'll set it up." As Sarah and Elon's efforts continued to grow, the world began to notice a shift. People were no longer just looking for success in terms of financial gain or career achievement. They were starting to look for success in terms of human connection, kindness, and understanding. And as more and more people began to question the judgments they had once placed on others, the world felt a little smaller, more connected, more compassionate. But it wasn't always smooth sailing. There were still critics, people who felt that the #SeeTheHuman movement was too idealistic, too abstract to create real, lasting change. They argued that society was too entrenched in its biases, too unwilling to make a deep shift. Sarah received a message one day from a woman who had seen the interview and felt compelled to challenge her. "You're talking about empathy, but what about the people who don't want to change? What about the ones who don't care about kindness or seeing others as equals? What about them?" Sarah's response was simple, but heartfelt. "We can't change everyone, but we can start with ourselves. We can choose to see people for who they really are, not what we want them to be. And if enough of us do that, then the change will start to spread. It's slow, it's gradual, but it's real." As Sarah continued to share her message, something unexpected happened. People who had once been blind to the human stories around them began to change. A woman in a coffee shop overheard a conversation and decided to speak up to stop a man from being unfairly criticized for his appearance. A teacher noticed a student being bullied for their differences and stepped in to offer support. People started to see each other, not just as labels, but as individuals with their own unique stories, struggles, and joys. The shift was happening. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't immediate, but it was happening. In the quiet of his office, Elon stood by the window once again, looking out at the sprawling city below. The noise of the world was still there, the calls for innovation, for technology to solve humanity's greatest challenges. But now, something else had taken root in his mind. The idea that technology alone wasn't enough. It was empathy that could fuel the future. Empathy was the missing piece. And as Elon thought about the work ahead, he realized that this movement, this ripple of human connection, was far more important than any rocket he'd ever launched or any car he'd ever built. Because it wasn't about the future of technology. It was about the future of humanity. And that, in the end, was what would shape the world for generations to come. Months had passed since the world first became aware of Sarah and Elon's unexpected encounter at the airport. What started as a moment of judgment had turned into a life-changing, worldwide movement that not only touched hearts but also began to change the way people interacted with one another. What was once an isolated incident had now evolved into something much bigger, an entire paradigm shift in how humanity viewed success, judgment, and empathy. Sarah and Elon had grown into unexpected allies, united by a cause far greater than themselves. They spent their days traveling, speaking at conferences, meeting with leaders, and supporting initiatives that focused on human connection and breaking down the barriers of bias and judgment. But as they continued to share their message with the world, they couldn't help but wonder, was this truly the change they were hoping for? Or had it all become just another trend, a fleeting moment of good intentions? One evening, as Sarah sat alone in her apartment in New York, she felt the weight of the journey settling in. She had never imagined that a simple mistake, one that she'd hoped would be forgotten, could have led to something so impactful. She had no idea that it would evolve into an entire movement, and now, she found herself questioning whether she was still the same person she had been before the incident. "Have I changed?" she whispered to herself. "Am I still who I was before all of this?" The questions lingered in her mind, weighing heavily. It was hard to answer, because she wasn't sure. She had become someone she never expected to be, a public figure, a spokesperson for empathy, an advocate for kindness. But had she really embraced this new identity, or had it simply been thrust upon her? Sarah thought back to the first time she met Elon at the airport. He had been calm, collected, and understanding. It wasn't just the wealth, the fame, or the success that made him who he was. It was his ability to see past the surface and connect with people on a deeper level. She remembered the way he had listened, without judgment, and the way he had given her space to grow and learn. That moment, that small act of kindness, had become a turning point in her life. But now, standing at the crossroads of her own personal evolution, Sarah didn't want to lose herself in the noise of public expectations. She didn't want to be defined by the moment she had made a mistake, but by how she had moved forward and how she had chosen to learn and grow. She realized that the journey wasn't just about leading a movement or speaking at events. It was about continuing to evolve, to be present in each moment, and to never stop learning. Meanwhile, across the country in California, Elon was also grappling with similar thoughts. Sitting in his office at SpaceX, he looked out at the horizon, his thoughts consumed by the same questions that had been keeping Sarah up at night. The movement had grown, and it was becoming clear that the message of empathy and human connection had found a place in the hearts of millions. But what now? Elon had spent his life pursuing technological advancements, building companies that reshaped entire industries. But this felt different. The work was more intangible, the results harder to measure. It was a cause that required patience, time, and a deep belief in humanity's ability to change. Can we really make a lasting difference? Elon asked himself, standing up from his desk and walking to the window. Or is this just a brief moment of enlightenment? He knew that the impact of the movement would take years, perhaps even decades, to fully realize. But that didn't scare him. In fact, it inspired him. It wasn't about seeing immediate results. It was about planting the seeds of change and watching them grow over time. The world was changing, slowly but surely, and he knew that if he could continue to use his voice, his influence, and his resources to push the conversation forward, then maybe, just maybe, things could be different. But as he stared out at the stars, he couldn't help but wonder if this was just the beginning of a much bigger journey. One that went beyond the borders of Earth, beyond the realm of technology, and into the heart of what it truly meant to be human. One day, not long after their reflective moments, Sarah and Elon were scheduled to meet again, this time for a special gathering at a community center in a small town outside of Los Angeles. It wasn't a big conference or a high-profile event. It was just a group of local volunteers, teachers, and activists who were committed to spreading the message of empathy and kindness in their own communities. When they arrived at the center, they were greeted with warmth and enthusiasm. The room was filled with people from all walks of life, each person carrying their own story of struggle, hope, and perseverance. Sarah and Elon spoke candidly about their journey, sharing the lessons they had learned, the challenges they had faced, and the profound impact the movement had on their lives. "I've learned a lot," Sarah said to the group, her voice steady but emotional. "I've learned that empathy isn't just something you talk about. It's something you practice every single day. And the more we practice it, the more it becomes a part of who we are. It's not about being perfect. It's about being willing to be better." Elon nodded in agreement. "It's about seeing the potential in others. It's about believing that no matter where you come from or who you are, you have the power to make a difference. And if we all start with empathy, the world can change in ways we can't even imagine." As the day wore on, the conversations continued. People shared their own stories, of how they had learned to see others in a new light, of how they had chosen to lead with empathy rather than judgment. It was a powerful moment, one that reinforced what Sarah and Elon had come to realize. The movement was no longer just about them. It was about everyone who had been touched by the idea that they could do better, be better, and see the humanity in those around them. By the end of the day, Sarah and Elon stood outside the community center, looking out at the sunset. It had been a simple day, but it had been a powerful one. "It's strange," Elon said, looking over at Sarah. "We've spoken to thousands, even millions of people. But sometimes it's the small moments, the ones that don't make the headlines, that really matter." Sarah smiled. "Yeah, maybe that's where the real change happens." And as they walked away, side by side, they both knew that while the world had changed in many ways, there was still much work to be done. But they were no longer focused on the destination. They were focused on the journey, the small, everyday choices to see each other for who we truly are, not just who we appear to be. And in that, they had found a new beginning.